Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate the introduction. And I just want to begin by asking for some grace. I'm actually teaching today from my office at the hospital. And so if you hear background noise, please forgive me. I'm not home. So let us begin. I came across a few weeks ago an article that caught my eye. I was actually having breakfast with my father-in-law after not seeing my family for over a year, as many of us have not had the opportunity to do. We were quietly having breakfast together, and I was just really enjoying the time. And he was reading the Wall Street Journal, a paper that I don't normally read. And there was an article there that caught my eye. The title of which, The Boy Who Learned to See and What He Can Teach Us About Vision. I thought that was an enticing story for me to explore. And this is the story. It's about a boy who was born blind and spent his entire childhood without sight. And of course, developed all kinds of amazing qualities that allowed him, including a great sense of imagination that allowed him to navigate the world and a support system. And at the age of 15, after undergoing a series of surgeries, he was given back, or given for the first time, the sense of sight. So physicians were able to return to him the sense of sight that he wasn't born with. And this story takes place 5 years after, where he's able to tell us what the last 5 years of his life have been like after the surgeries. And of course, we would think, wow, what a gift. What was it like for him to finally be able to see? And surprisingly, what the narrative is that the last 5 years have been filled with tremendous suffering. And that just because he was able to see doesn't mean that his brain was neurologically wired to process the gift of sight. And so he couldn't recognize faces, and he couldn't recognize objects, and he couldn't recognize lines, and things were blurry and confusing. And it threw him into a time of desperation. And it really makes us wonder about perception and the way in which we process the things that we see and the gifts that we're given. And I want to make sure you understand that I'm not sharing this with any I'm sharing this with a tremendous sense of compassion and empathy toward this boy. And also, what a human experience, right? What an interesting human experience. His mother even said she wasn't sure that the surgery was worth it, that it's been so hard that she isn't sure that they would make the same decision again. So, it made me think of, and I want to say also that after 5 years of practice and exerted effort, he's living a normal life. But it has taken that practice and effort. And it made me think of the Torah narrative that we're in now. We are coming to the end of the book of Numbers. And of course, in a way, it's really the end of the narrative, because once we begin reading the next book, it's sort of the repetition of what we already know. So in a way, we have come to the end of the narrative about the Israelites and their experience. And the very last Torah portion of this book, the Midbar, in the wilderness, which is translated into English as Numbers, but in Hebrew really means wilderness. There's a list. You would think that the last portion would be, I don't know, some interesting, juicy narrative, but really it's just a list. It's a list of places that the Israelites had stopped on their journey, which I found to be very interesting. And in all, there are 42 places that are listed. And so there's a question, what is this list all about? So I'll return to that in a moment. What I want to touch on is the sense of sight, or I'm sorry, the sense of verbalization that the Israelites are given in the wilderness. So in the book of Exodus, the mystics call the book of Exodus oftentimes Galut Hadibor. It is a time when the Israelites don't have the capacity to speak, that really their voice comes through under oppression of slavery as groans and moans and cries. There isn't speech that they have the capacity for. And it is through liberation and going into the wilderness that they actually find their voice. And they begin to sing. They sing with Miriam. They pray. They even complain. And what's interesting is this very same human experience of having been given the gift of speech makes, we hear that the first thing they ask is, couldn't we go back? Couldn't we go back to Egypt? This is too hard. This is really difficult. And it makes me think of our spiritual growth, that oftentimes in our meditation practice, what we're doing is we're cultivating a different way of seeing the world. We're cultivating compassion toward others and toward ourselves. We are cultivating a new way of relating to one another and to the experiences that we're having. And I'm thinking about this past year of having the sense of cocooning in a period of time of great uncertainty, but also a period of time of tremendous potential and growth. I've had time to study. I've had time to pray. I've had time to meditate every day in ways that I have not in years. I've had time to connect with Chavruta partners. And I think that many of us can probably share that experience in this community. As we come together, we've developed this practice of coming together every day. And it changed us. And it's been hard. And now we have to learn how to relate to the world. We have to find new neural pathways to make sense of it all, to live with a softened heart, to live knowing how to breathe. So in many ways, I relate to this boy who learned to see, was given the sense of vision, but needed time to learn how to process it all. And Adi, if you wouldn't mind sharing my source sheet, I want to share with you, if you wouldn't mind just going down. You're welcome. I'll share the source sheet with you. Basically, I've paraphrased some things that I've used in the source sheet, but what I would really like to share with you as a practice today, as we enter into Shabbat, is a prayer in which we recognize that even in our times of growth, even in our times of spiritual development and expansion and liberation, there are these knots that we have. There are these obstacles that we come across. There are these hindrances that we have to deal with over and over again. They come up as doubt. They come up as questioning. Does it really make sense for me to sit here today for this next hour? I have so much to do. My life is already being pulled in so many different directions by this new pace that we're entering. And so this prayer called Ana Bekawach is connected to the 42 stops that we see mentioned in the last Torah portion of Bamidbar, because it contains within it 42 letters of God's unpronounceable name. And it's sort of an acrostic, or the first letter of each of the words contains, it has 42 words, and so 42 letters that are related to God's name. And in a way, it is also asking for help. It is traditionally said on Shabbat, before Lachadodi. And in the mystical tradition, it becomes a portal into this other realm in which we feel held and supported. The first words are Ana bekoach gedula tiamincha ta'atir tserura. Untie my knots, please untie these knots with the strength of your right hand. And I brought to share with you the words of Rabbi Sheila Peltz Weinberg as she interpretively translated this poem. I'm sorry, Adi, would you go back? Thank you. And she says, I offer myself to the greatness and goodness of all that is to untie these knots, to participate and yield. Thank you, Adi. To participate in and yield to this process of purification and joy, to be blessed, released, held in mercy, and to be forgiven right now, to accept the tender unfolding guidance that always appears, to once again have my sacred center mirrored in the Eternal One. So I invite you to come into our posture. The last few words are receive our suffering, receive our cries. I invite you to come into our posture for the next 15 minutes. Let us come to the center of our being, knowing that even when we know how to connect with all of the touch points of our body, how to connect with our breath, how to connect with the essence of our being, the rootedness, the gravity that holds us in place. When we close our eyes, sometimes what arises is doubt or fear or anxiousness. And in those moments, we can say, Ana bekoach, help me to untie these knots so that I can come into the essence of my experience, so that I can see and process what I am seeing, so that I can feel and not numb out, so that I can cultivate the gifts that I have been given through my practice and have the patience to use them well. Anna bekoach gdulat yaminha ta'atir tserura. Anna bekoach gdulat yaminha ta'atir tserura. Let us sit in silence. Breathing. Sometimes in our practice, what arises is resistance. Perhaps it would have been better not to feel at all. And yet we return over and over again to the growth we have made together, to the new skills we have gained and the gifts we've received. And as we bring our meditation to a close, I'd love to read a poem by Rachel Kahn, a teacher of mine, called The Truth of Love. Love is a force stronger than you've ever given it credit for. It is not the passive submission you fear it to be. Love is where the rubber hits the road. Your suffering does not make you a stranger, it makes you human. Discomfort is guidance from your soul compass toward what really matters. The out-of-tune piano prays to be played in new ways, refuses to be discarded, wants its good parts to be made useful, longs for new melodies created from the invention bred of necessity. Awakened, we can no longer afford the luxury of unconsciousness, its price now outside our purview. Praise be to these united states of broken hearts, these shattered instruments of transmission forcing us to see with new eyes, to feel with raw nerved belief, to fly with no net, to go collectively off script, to dismantle the illusion and know the truth of love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marita, as always. And friends, we seal the practice by creating a circle of support for those of us who are in mourning, observing a yard site. We invite those of you who are, if you'd like to share the name or names of those who you're remembering or holding in your heart today in the chat box, either now or at the end of the recitation of Kaddish. Thanks to Adi for sharing the words on the screen. And I invite you to join me in rising in body or in spirit. Yitgadal, Yikadash, Shemei Rabba, Yama, Divra, Tiyute, Bialich, Malkute, Kayecho, Yemechon, Uchaye, Deval Beit Yisrael, Hagala, Disman Kari,
Shmei
Rabba, Rabba, Amen,
Rabba,
Arash, Yishtar, Yitalel, Yihalal, Shmei, Kushata, Baruch Mikol Birchata,
Shamiran,
Amiran, Ba'alan, V'imru,
Shalom,
Yehi Shlama Rabban Shemayim, L'chaim, Malenu, L'Yisrael,
Yokol Yisrael,
Aseh Shalom Ba'alan,
Yimaru,
Aseh Shalom, Aleinu V'Yakol Yisrael, El Kol Yoshvei Teitel, Imru, Amen.
Amen.
And friends, thank you so much for joining us as always. Thank you, Marita Anderson, for that. And once again, a beautiful teaching and practice. For those who are able, would like to stay on for a few minutes of conversation with Marita about the teaching and about the practice, welcome to do so. And for those who are leaving us now, I want to wish you Shabbat Shalom and Chodesh Tov for the new month of Av, which arrives as well tonight. And look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks when I return, and know that leaving you in very good hands with my IJS colleagues and the teachers who will be here in the meantime. So please do enjoy that for the first 2 weeks of the month of Av. Thanks to Adi Stein, as always, for holding this space with skill and with grace. And if you do have a question for Marita, please put it in the chat box and preface it with a question in all caps. I'll try to keep an eye on that. Marita, thank you so much. As always, beautiful, just great. And if you don't mind, before we end, it'd be wonderful to seal the deal with another round of Ana B'choach. It was beautiful to hear you and to do that together. So I'd like to, if I can, just restate the teaching, just to make sure I received it clearly. There's so many wonderful pieces to it. But I guess what I heard was, even when it comes to things that we think of as redemptive, description of that procedure to restore sight, or leaving Egypt, or coming out of a pandemic, if we are in fact coming out of a pandemic, for those of us who are privileged to be in that position, we think, oh, this is great, this is fantastic. And then it turns out to be much more complicated. And as you said at the end, and there's resistance, and it seems illogical or irrational. Like, aren't they happy to get out of Egypt? Why are they want to go back to that? And yet we find it. And so you're describing that there's a need to allow space for the knots that are there, right, to be untangled. And of course, we're all big fans of Sheila, so love that image of God as the loosener, untire of knots. But just to stick with the enslavement metaphor, just that as the bonds of slavery are lifted, it doesn't happen boom like that. It has to happen. There has to be a gradual loosening internally as well. So I just want to make sure I got that right. Yes.
Yeah, you got it. You got it exactly.
Okay.
And, yeah, and I was thinking about this wandering. Sometimes I wonder, like, what was the purpose of wandering through the desert for 40 years, right? And so what is the purpose of this boy who was blind to, clearly there's a purpose. It took him time to learn how to see, and it took the Israelites time to learn how to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes us time to learn how to be still. Yeah, I think you got it. You got what I was trying to transmit, in the sense that resistance arises, and it's very much an experience, and it's not anything for us to be to beat ourselves up over, but to notice and recognize and name it. And even I love this practice of noticing where the knots are. Sometimes it's in the body, sometimes it's as resistance arises, and welcoming it in as an old friend, like, oh yes, I see you, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I see you're trying to protect me. I see that it would be easier. It may have been easier not to see it all. But here we are, and we're only moving forward. There's no movement backwards, right? That I think that the point of listing the stations of all of the stops is that constant movement forward.
Right. Thanks for bringing that back in. Forgot about that. So, right, the stopping points along the way, and then the other part is that it's intergenerational, right? Because it's not even the story of the 40 years. Is that it's not just that one generation needed 40 years, and then they could come into the land, but actually it's a process that stretches out. It's a multi-generational process that can't happen in one generation. And then, of course, we get the story of Moses too. And
right.
Even he, had plenty of knots plenty of kinks that he didn't have worked out along the way. So here's the other thing: is that word, which I had never really noticed this, but I'm going to share my screen if it's okay for a sec, just to go back to the text. And Adi, actually, if you can put the link to the text back in, I see a couple people are asking for it. And I know there's going to be a question about your friend's poem too, Ruth Kahn. So
it's Rachel Kahn,
Rachel,
a book called How to Bless the Moon. How to Bless the New Moon.
How do you spell Rachel Kahn?
It's Kann, Rachel Kahn.
Kann, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I can believe tonight, I think it was last night that we celebrated Rosh Chodesh Av, and so she has some wonderful poems here for that as well. Anyway, it's a great book.
So the word, oops, now I lost it. I'm sorry. sorry, here we go. Here we go. The word here, just going to highlight it there if I can. There we go. Tatir Tura. So that word Tura shows up in the memorial prayer, El Malirachamim, where we pray that the soul of the departed will be Tzur B'Tzur HaChayim, will be interwoven with the bonds. It's usually included in the bonds of life, but it's kind of this, wrapped up. So I'm not sure what to do with this. I just wanted to share that association. And I guess what I was going with that was that on the one hand, there are these interconnections that we are part of, that our soul is part of, but that in our bodies, in our incarnate selves, in our embodied selves, then our materiality has its own set of knots that become our challenge, or the locus of our spiritual work, right?
Yeah, I think my practice has been to notice the knots as protective, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're there to protect me. They're there for a reason. They're not there to hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually, paradoxically, allows me to soften around them, right? So the tension that I feel in my body, if we want to talk about the physicality of it, the tension that I feel is there because my body is attempting to get me ready for the challenges ahead. When I'm in my practice, I want to say, thank you, body. In this moment, I can rest. Thank you for holding me and for allowing me the strength to face whatever I'm facing. In this moment, I can soften. I can practice softening. In this moment, I'm not in a fight. I don't have to take that posture. And so when approaching my inner knots from not a place of there's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with the way I'm responding to these different situations, but, oh, wow, this is challenging. Thank you. In this moment, I'm safe. It's a constant conversation. It's a relationship with the inner experience. And I also really love, with this prayer, I really love visualizing the talit, because we have all the knots on the fringes of the talit that in a way, so when I say untie these knots, there's something very specific. It's a specific feeling that I am trying to cultivate. And yet I'm also deeply connected to the physical aspect of holding these knots, these fringes, as part of being connected to my tradition.
So it's as you describe it so beautifully, it's really, a lot of this is paradox, right? It's not that knots are bad. In fact, the opposite. In fact, I'm grateful to you for lifting up that idea that, the symptoms of resistance, which we experience as unpleasant, we in this practice, and I think this is really can't be repeated enough, is that the purpose of the practice is, just as you were beautifully describing, is able to see clearly and to be with those, and instead of running from them, avoiding them, denying them, seeing and being with them, being present with them. And the theory of change, which people have to test out in their own experience, is that may then lead to some loosening, softening, that reveal the change that is waiting to happen, or the sacred spark that is embedded in it, however people want to understand that. There's a question that goes right to that. Lori wrote, "My eyes and vision feel so new, they can now see my knots that I was blind to before. My question has been about how much to deliberately externalize this internal process in my close and community interactions versus allowing the knot unraveling between me and God." I'm not sure if I understand that question. How to externalize this internal process? I don't know, Lori, I don't know if you can expand on that a little bit. But I do, just to hold up the part of the question that I think is really, really important here, is that it's about seeing the knots and not acting them out, right? It's about not being reactive to them in some way. So my question to you, maybe this is Lori's question, is when you're not in meditation, you're not sitting here, but you're going back out to be a chaplain in a few minutes. What happens in real life for you when this is happening, when you become aware of however the knots manifest for
I think
you?
a lot of self-forgiveness, right? A lot of self-forgiveness. Recognition that this is human, this is a human experience, these kinds of resistances that arise, whether they are in a form of doubt or in a form of anxiety, very human, and not anything to push away from, but really to explore with curiosity. And I think what happens to me is sometimes I get really frustrated. And actually, this happens to me a lot in parenting. It happened to me this morning. My children are going off to camp this weekend.
Do tell.
Okay, so my children are going off to camp this weekend, and my house is a total wreck because they're packing for camp, and the number of things that they need is just mind-boggling. And I get really anxious when there's chaos. So this morning I was trying to get ready for work, and my daughter was packing or just throwing things around, and I yelled. I was not nice. And the frustration that I had was, how is it possible that after 10 years of meditation practice, after, I have, I'm a chaplain, I'm going to work to comfort those who are suffering. And yet I snapped at my daughter in ways that did not make her feel good. And so, there's different ways of approaching that. I can notice and recover and repair. And that is what I'm focusing on. And maybe that's Lori's question about externalizing this internal process.
Yeah.
That I think it's about recovery and repair. And that begins with noticing and self-forgiveness, right? Because if I could also imagine in the past, I would have this experience of, I give up. But I can't give up. I can't give up on my beloveds, right? So it's and I can't give up on me. I have made a vow to be compassionate toward myself. So I think that's the practice. The practice is recognizing the humanity in our resistances, in our failures, in our I hate to call them failures, but shortcomings, and remembering the importance of that return.
Right. Well, beautiful description of the process of tshuva, right? We have the intention, we miss the mark, come back, rinse and repeat. Well, I will say I relate 1,000% to that situation. And thanks for sharing that. And as always, I think we're at times, unfortunately, so I don't think we have a time for a reprise of Ana B'Choach, but I want to thank you, Marita, for that, and thank everybody for being here today. Wishing you a Chodesh Tov. It actually does begin tonight. Tonight, Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh Av. And it's a beautiful teaching for tshuva, leading us into the month of Av and this overall season of Av and Elul, and turning from open-heartedness and broken-heartedness back to wholeness, and as we learned yesterday, ultimately to simcha, to joy. So thanks for making time. It's been your work day too, Marita. Thank you. And thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Adi, and Shabbat Shalom.